In the spring of 1834, the hills of central Virginia carried the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. It was a season of rebirth, apple blossoms stretching toward thin sunlight, wagon wheels grinding through mud, the slow rhythm of ordinary life returning after a long winter. To anyone traveling the narrow dirt road between Richmond and Charlottesville, the countryside looked peaceful, almost biblical in its quiet perfection. But peace, as history so often reminds us, can hide things that defy imagination. The story begins in a township called Milbrook, a scatter of farms, a single crossroads, and a community bound by trust more than by law. In 1834, Milbrook was home to fewer than 200 souls. Families lived by the calendar of the soil, planting, harvest, worship, and rest. The townsfolk knew each other's routines so well that any new sound, any unusual pattern of smoke, drew a raised eyebrow and a whispered remark at Henderson's general store. It was here, in this small, self-contained world, that Ezra Sullivan and his wife Constance built their reputation as upright, God-fearing people. Their farmhouse stood 2 miles beyond the last row of cultivated tobacco, a tidy white clapboard home with a wraparound porch and a red barn framed neatly behind it. Travelers often remarked that the Sullivan property looked like a painting of contented rural life. Ezra's fences were straight, his fields orderly, his livestock healthy. Constance tended a kitchen garden that seemed to bloom before anyone else's. If there was one thing Milbrook valued above all else, it was reputation, and the Sullivans appeared flawless. Ezra, son of a prosperous tobacco trader, had inherited both money and manners. Constance, dark-haired, soft-spoken, educated in Pennsylvania, carried herself with quiet dignity. They attended Methodist services when health permitted, donated to the church roof fund, and perhaps most impressively, claimed to take in orphaned children who had nowhere else to go. No one questioned the story. Death in the 1800s was as common as rain. Typhus, childbirth, poor harvests all could leave children stranded within a single season. When Constance mentioned that she cared for relatives' orphans until proper homes could be arranged, the town saw only Christian charity. At Henderson's store, the ledger told its own version of the tale. Every fortnight, Constance purchased flour, salt, molasses, and pork in quantities that seemed excessive for a couple without kin. She bought medicine, too. Quinine, tinctures for fever, laudanum, iodine, bandages. When Thomas Henderson remarked on the expense, Constance would offer a gentle smile. Children from hardship arrive sickly, she'd say. They need time and care to heal. Henderson wrote the sale, pocketed the cash, and felt the warmth of doing business with good people. Even the local doctor, Marcus Whitfield, found comfort in her explanations. He was a traveling physician who serviced farms spread across 30 miles of backcountry. Constance often met him at the gate rather than letting him inside, describing the symptoms of her young wards and requesting medicines by name. "They're frightened of strangers," she'd explain. "So many have lost their families. Best if I treat them myself." Her knowledge of medical detail impressed him. He noted it in his journal. Mrs. Sullivan, educated woman, precise, perhaps trained by a nurse relative. Years later, he would read that line again and tremble. Milbrook accepted the Sullivans as it accepted the rhythm of the seasons. If the lights from their farmhouse sometimes burned past midnight, if faint hammering echoed through the valley long after other homes had gone dark, it was chalked up to industriousness. Ezra was improving the cellar, he said, a practical project given the region's humidity and the need for cool storage. The farmers who had helped with the digging remembered nothing unusual. Each man worked his own section, paid in silver and told to mind only his portion. None saw the finished space. By 1834, the Sullivan farm was both admired and quietly mysterious. The children Constance claimed to care for were rarely seen. Now and then a face would appear in the wagon beside her, pale, silent, gone the next visit. "Shy little things," she'd say. Traumatized. The community, softened by sympathy, never pressed further, and why would they? Constance spoke with the calm assurance of righteousness. She donated to widows. She visited the ill. She hosted the Reverend Matthews for tea every Advent and listened to his sermons with apparent devotion. He once wrote in a church circular that the Sullivans represent the finest Christian charity our county can offer. That sentence would come to haunt him. What no one could see, what no one wanted to see, was that beneath the floorboards of that perfect farmhouse, a secret world had been built, stone by stone. Ezra's cellar extended far beyond any root cellar. Hidden passages branched under the earth like veins. The deeper he dug, the less daylight touched his conscience. For more than 2 decades, the Sullivans' deception held. But evil, no matter how patient, leaves traces, and in 1834 those traces began to surface. That winter was the harshest in living memory. The James River froze twice. Livestock perished in their stalls. When March arrived, the land thawed unevenly, releasing a sour smell from the soil. Neighbors said the earth itself seemed uneasy. One of the first outsiders to sense it was a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern. On the 23rd of February, he left Richmond with a wagon load of cloth and trinkets bound for Charlottesville. Snow caught him halfway, blinding and relentless. By dusk he could see nothing but the faint outline of a house through the storm, a white shape against gray sky. He knocked, teeth chattering. Ezra answered after a long pause. Inside, the warmth was welcome, but something felt wrong. The meal was plain, cornbread and salted pork, but eaten in near silence. Stern tried to make conversation. His hosts replied with polite fragments. Constance's hand shook when she poured coffee. Ezra flinched at small noises as if listening for something below the wind. That night, lying on a cot near the parlor stove, Stern heard what he later described as soft crying under the floorboards. Not the moan of wind or the squeak of wood, but muffled sobs, many voices, small, weary, hopeless. He froze listening. The sound ebbed, then returned. When morning came, he asked cautiously whether the Sullivans kept livestock below. Ezra smiled stiffly. "Old house," he said. "The wind moves through the beams. You'll get used to it." Stern left uneasy but alive. He would remember those sounds for the rest of his days. 3 weeks later, another traveler sought the same house, Mary Catherine Flynn, an Irish girl of 16 separated from her family while crossing the river on foot. She arrived at dusk, soaked and shivering, asking for warmth. Constance welcomed her inside. That night the girl vanished. Search parties combed the woods. No trace was found. People assumed she had drowned. They were wrong. By April, whispers had begun in Milbrook. Farmers returning from the field spoke of strange noises on still nights, metal clinking faintly or cries carried on the wind. Dogs refused to approach the Sullivan property. Yet even then, disbelief held stronger than suspicion. These were the Sullivans, after all, the kind couple with the orphans. It took a man named William Hutchinson to break that spell. Hutchinson was a hunter more than a farmer, a quiet man accustomed to the sounds of the woods. On the 2nd of April 1834, he went out before dawn to set snares near the boundary line of the Sullivan farm. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs. As he waited, he heard something he could not mistake, the terrified scream of a child. It came once, then again, from the direction of the farmhouse. Hutchinson crouched behind an oak, heart hammering. The cries were joined by others, higher, fainter, as though many throats had tried to call for help and lost their strength. He crept closer until the house filled his view. Lights glowed behind shuttered windows. Then he saw movement. Ezra Sullivan emerging from a low side door half buried in the earth, a lantern in his hand. Ezra glanced around, then disappeared underground. The door closed. The scream stopped. Hutchinson fled. He ran all the way home and told his neighbors what he'd witnessed. The story spread by supper. Some scoffed. Others felt a chill they couldn't explain. The next morning, Hutchinson rode to town and filed a complaint with Sheriff Benjamin Crawford. Crawford was a veteran lawman, a tall, methodical man who had spent 15 years keeping peace in the county. At first he suspected hysteria, but procedure was procedure. On the morning of April 8th, he saddled his horse, called his deputy Marcus Webb, and set out for the Sullivan property. What they found there would end one chapter of Virginia's history and begin another far darker one. The morning of April 8, 1834, began like any other in Henrico County. A low mist hung over the fields, and the chill of early spring still clung to the air. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford rode at an even pace, his deputy Marcus Webb beside him, their horses' hooves thudding softly against the packed earth of the road. They expected little more than a routine visit, perhaps a misunderstanding to put to rest, a bit of gossip that had gone too far. Milbrook was a small town, and small towns thrived on stories. But as the Sullivan farmhouse came into view, its white paint gleaming through the haze, its porch perfectly swept, Crawford felt an unease that he couldn't quite name. Something about the place looked too still, as if the world itself held its breath around it. Constance met them at the door. Her composure was remarkable. She smiled softly, offered them coffee, and inquired whether the ride from town had been cold. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes never darted. If anything, she looked relieved to see them. "We've heard troubling rumors, ma'am," Crawford began gently. "A few of your neighbors say they've heard children crying at night. You can understand how such talk might spread." Constance's expression turned sympathetic, almost pitying. "Poor things," she said. "They're ill, Sheriff. Many of them lost their families. The nightmares have been terrible. I do my best to comfort them, but—" She sighed, and the sound was convincing, graceful, weary, believable. "People fear what they don't understand," Crawford nodded. It all sounded plausible enough. Still, he asked to see the children. Constance hesitated for the briefest moment. "They're sleeping," she said. "The fever leaves them restless. I'd rather not wake them." Deputy Webb, younger and less patient, caught the hesitation. "We'll be quiet," he said, a quick look to ease concern. Constance's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of alarm. "If you insist," she murmured, "though it pains me to disturb them." The inspection began upstairs. The rooms were immaculate. Beds made, curtains drawn, the faint scent of lavender soap. No sign of children. Constance explained that most of them slept in the loft during warm weather. She opened a small door to a narrow staircase, and indeed the loft was full of bedrolls, empty but orderly. Crawford noted the detail and said nothing. When Webb excused himself to use the privy, the story began to crack. Rounding the corner of the house, he saw what the farmer Hutchinson had described. A low, heavy door built into the earth, secured with not one but 3 iron padlocks. Fresh claw marks scored the wood near the locks, deep enough to draw splinters. The ground around the entrance was disturbed, as if something or someone had tried to dig upward. Webb's stomach turned. He returned quietly to the kitchen, where Crawford was still listening to Constance speak about her orphans. The deputy leaned close and whispered a few words that made the sheriff's jaw tighten. Crawford turned back to their hostess. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said evenly, "we'll need to see your cellar." The change was instant. Her color drained. Her poise evaporated. "The cellar?" she stammered. "There's nothing down there but tools and old preserves. It's damp, unsafe, you could hurt yourselves. Really, there's no reason—" Before she could finish, a sound interrupted her, faint but unmistakable, a low, broken sob coming from beneath their feet. Then another, and another. The silence that followed felt endless. Crawford's hand went to the butt of his revolver. Webb stepped toward the sound. "Ma'am," Crawford said quietly, "open the door." When she didn't move, he gave the order again, more firmly. Still she stood frozen, eyes wide, lips parted as if in prayer. Webb brushed past her, went outside, and began breaking the locks one by one. The third took the longest, thick iron, rusted but solid. When it finally snapped, the door creaked open with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The stench hit them first. A suffocating mix of human waste, mildew, rot, and something else. Something sour and ancient, like despair made physical. Crawford covered his mouth with a handkerchief. He lifted his lantern, and the flame shuddered in the rising air. Steps led down into darkness. Neither man spoke as they descended. The light swayed over damp stone walls, over iron rings set into masonry, over lengths of chain that clinked faintly as the door's hinge settled back into place. Then the light touched skin, small hands, bare feet, faces too thin to belong to the living. 47 children chained in rows, staring through the dim light at the strangers who had entered their nightmare. For a moment, no one moved. Webb's throat made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Crawford felt the world tilt beneath him. The children didn't cry out. They simply stared, wide-eyed and silent, as though uncertain whether rescue was another kind of trick. "Dear God," Crawford whispered. He crossed the room slowly, unhooking the first set of chains. The metal had rubbed the child's ankles raw. The boy didn't flinch. He simply fell sideways into Crawford's arms, weightless as kindling. Others began to weep softly as Webb worked the locks. The sound was small but unending, a chorus of exhaustion rather than hope. Behind them, footsteps thudded. Ezra Sullivan stood at the top of the stairs, a hammer in his hand. His face was ashen. "You shouldn't have come," he said flatly. Crawford drew his revolver. "Drop it, Ezra." For a second, Ezra hesitated. Then he let the hammer fall, the clatter echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Constance appeared behind him, her expression unreadable. She didn't fight. She didn't speak. She simply watched as her world collapsed. The rescue took hours. The children were led out one by one into the pale afternoon light. Neighbors who had followed the sheriff's wagon gathered, their disbelief turning to horror as the truth revealed itself. Some turned away. Others fell to their knees. Milbrook, a town that had prided itself on goodness, found itself staring into the mirror of its own ignorance. Crawford's official report would later describe a subterranean complex extending far beyond the footprint of the dwelling. The chambers were connected by narrow tunnels, their walls reinforced with stone and lime. Chains hung from bolts set deep in the masonry. In one room, crude medical instruments lay scattered on a table: scalpels, saws, bottles of laudanum, strips of soiled cloth. Another chamber contained ledgers and notes, meticulous records in Constance Sullivan's handwriting. Each child listed by age, arrival date, physical condition, and remarks like obedient, unruly, or to be replaced. The last room, reached through a crawl space barely wide enough for an adult to enter, contained the final proof of how long this horror had gone on. Shallow graves filled the floor, dusted with lime. 36 small bodies, preserved by the cold and the stone. When Crawford emerged from the cellar at dusk, he was not the same man who had ridden out that morning. His deputy sat on the porch steps, face gray, staring at nothing. Behind them, Constance Sullivan knelt in the doorway, hands folded, murmuring prayers no one cared to hear. Ezra sat beside her, wrists bound. Neither spoke. The days that followed brought chaos. Doctors arrived from Richmond to treat the children. Reporters from as far as Philadelphia came seeking details, though local authorities tried to suppress them. The sheriff's notes described the scene in words he would later regret writing. There was order in her cruelty. Method, precision, calculation. This was not madness, but enterprise. From the ledgers, investigators pieced together the scale of what had been hidden beneath that house. Children had been arriving since 1812, nearly a generation. Some came from poorhouses, others from cities hundreds of miles away. A few, like Mary Catherine Flynn, were travelers who vanished between destinations. Most, it seemed, had been purchased. The ledgers listed prices beside the names. Where the Sullivans found their supply and to whom they sold was a mystery, one that would grow darker with every discovery. The evidence suggested a network spanning multiple states, a shadow economy built on the trade of human life. Constance's letters, written in a simple cipher, referred to shipments, deliveries, and merchandise in need of discipline. Her handwriting was delicate and unhurried, as if she were describing the contents of a pantry rather than the suffering of children. The townspeople reacted in waves: disbelief, denial, anger, shame. Some swore they had always found the couple odd. Others defended them even after the arrests, insisting that the woman must have been possessed or driven mad by grief. But beneath the excuses lay a collective guilt too heavy to ignore. For more than 20 years the signs had been there. The night lights, the unusual purchases, the absence of laughter from a house supposedly full of children. No one had asked questions because no one wanted to disturb the comfort of their own decency. Within a week, the Sullivans were in custody. The children, 47 in all, were placed in temporary care at a church infirmary. Many were too weak to speak. A few clung to one another, whispering a single name when asked who had cared for them: Mother Sullivan. The newspapers eventually printed the story, though not the worst of it. The public was told of cruelty and neglect, but the deeper implications, the network, the trade, were kept quiet. America in 1834 wasn't ready to face what had been unearthed beneath that Virginia farmhouse, but for those who had seen it firsthand, there was no going back. Sheriff Crawford wrote in his final report, "If evil has a face, it is the calm smile of those who believe they are righteous." The investigation was far from over. The ledgers hinted at names beyond Milbrook, correspondence in Pennsylvania, Maryland, the Carolinas. Letters signed only with initials: M, GT, HB. The final entry, dated 2 months before the raid, mentioned an expected visitor from Charleston. "A man called Blackwood, what?" began as a local scandal was about to unravel into something far larger, a revelation that would challenge the limits of justice itself. When word of the Sullivan discovery spread beyond Milbrook, the quiet hills of Virginia seemed to lose their peace forever. In a single morning, the community's sense of itself, its goodness, its trust was shattered. What had begun as one farmer's uneasy report now stood revealed as one of the most haunting crimes the region had ever known. The morning after the raid, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford rode back to town in silence. He did not speak to his deputy. He could not. Webb's hand still trembled on the reins, his eyes unfocused. Behind them, the Sullivan farmhouse stood under guard, its white siding already stained by lantern smoke. Inside, deputies and volunteers cataloged the evidence, one piece of paper at a time. The smell of the cellar clung to their clothes. By mid-afternoon, the town square filled with uneasy spectators. People spoke in low tones, as though the air itself might carry their words to judgment. 47 children, someone whispered. 47. Others crossed themselves, muttering prayers or disbelief. The Reverend Matthews, who had praised the Sullivans for their charity, stood on the steps of his church and wept openly. That night, the sheriff's office became the center of a desperate effort to impose order on chaos. Crawford, exhausted but methodical, began the grim task of reading through the ledgers recovered from the Sullivan cellar. The pages were neatly bound, the handwriting elegant, the tone disturbingly domestic. Each entry followed the same pattern: a name, an age, a date of arrival, a brief note on health, behavior, and disposition. Some lines ended abruptly, as though the writer had grown distracted or indifferent. The earliest entries dated back more than 20 years. To Crawford's trained eye, the detail suggested an organized system rather than spontaneous cruelty. He shared this observation with the county magistrate, who at first resisted the idea. "A network? Sheriff, this is the work of 2 deranged individuals, not an enterprise." But Crawford persisted. "Then explain the correspondence," he said, tapping a stack of letters written in coded script. "Explain the payments." The magistrate could not. Within days, investigators from Richmond arrived to assist. Among them was Deputy Marshal Jonathan Price, a young but capable officer who had handled smuggling cases along the James River. Price's experience with coded documents proved invaluable. Using a cipher chart recovered from Constance Sullivan's personal desk, he began to decode the letters line by line. What emerged confirmed Crawford's suspicion: references to deliveries, quality assessments, and requests from contacts in multiple states. The language was cold, transactional, written with the precision of commerce. Each decoded letter deepened the mystery. The Sullivans were not acting alone. They were part of a supply chain, one that moved unseen through the fractured system of poorhouses, orphanages, and itinerant labor routes that marked early 19th century America. Children without records, without advocates, could vanish and no one would question it. The sheriff's notes from this period show a man struggling to balance duty with disbelief. "It is not only the cruelty that astonishes," he wrote, "but the quiet in which it was done. The community, the church, even I, none of us saw." Meanwhile, the children rescued from the Sullivan cellar were being cared for at a church infirmary in Richmond. Physicians described their recovery in cautious terms: malnourished, frightened, but alive. A few were able to speak after several days. Their words were simple and fragmented. They did not understand where they were or why the light stayed on at night. When asked who had cared for them, nearly all gave the same answer in the same uncertain tone: Mother Sullivan. For Sheriff Crawford, that phrase became the most haunting evidence of all. It spoke of indoctrination, of control through fear disguised as affection. The children had not simply been imprisoned, they had been taught to revere their captor. It was a cruelty of the mind as much as of the body. In late April, under growing public pressure, the Commonwealth of Virginia convened a special inquiry. Testimony from craftsmen who had worked on the Sullivan property confirmed the existence of a long-term project to enlarge the basement. Each worker had been hired for short stretches, paid in cash, and told that the construction was for storage. None had seen the finished result. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who had supplied Constance with medicine for years, came forward voluntarily. His voice broke as he recounted how she had described illnesses, always secondhand, always with technical precision. "She knew exactly what to ask for," he said. "I thought her devoted. I see now I was a fool." His cooperation would later prove instrumental in tracing the network's methods. By early May, investigators had identified at least 3 other locations in Virginia where similar disappearances had been reported over the previous decade. None showed evidence as extreme as Milbrook, but the pattern was unmistakable. Small farming communities, charitable caregivers, vanished orphans, untraceable correspondence. Each thread led outward, toward the same shadowy connections in Pennsylvania and the Carolinas. Crawford and Deputy Marshal Price followed the paper trail. Bank records, shipping invoices, and coded letters pointed to a single recurring name: H. Blackwood, a wealthy planter from Charleston. His letters to Constance were written with careful politeness, requesting healthy stock for domestic service and discussing payments in precise amounts. To the untrained eye, the correspondence could have been mistaken for trade in goods, but the context left little doubt. When questioned, Constance refused to explain the meaning of her ledgers. She spoke softly, sometimes smiling, as though she pitied the men trying to understand her. "You will not stop it," she told Crawford once. "It began before me. It will go on after me." Those words unsettled him more than any evidence. As spring turned to summer, federal authorities grew involved. The case now crossed state lines, raising questions about jurisdiction. For the first time, U.S. Marshals were authorized to assist in what was officially described as a multi-state investigation into child trafficking. The term was new to the legal system, but the horror behind it was not. Reporters called it the Sullivan affair. The story spread from Richmond to New York, then overseas to London. Readers were fascinated and horrified in equal measure. How could such things happen in a civilized nation? How could they happen undetected in the heart of a small church-going town? Editorials demanded reforms, better oversight of orphanages, stricter record-keeping, harsher penalties for kidnappers. For the first time, Americans began to see vulnerable children not as unfortunate statistics, but as people in need of protection. In Milbrook, life could not return to normal. The house stood empty under guard, its windows boarded, the soil around it newly disturbed from excavation. Farmers avoided the road that passed nearby. Some claimed to hear voices on still nights. Others insisted the ground itself felt colder there. The Reverend moved his sermons to the open field, saying the church walls felt too confining after what they had learned. Sheriff Crawford continued his work quietly. He sent updates to Washington, compiled witness statements, and cataloged evidence with meticulous care. Yet privately, he admitted that some questions might never be answered. "The evil we found was not sudden," he wrote. "It was built over years, one small compromise at a time, and all of us helped build it by looking away." By autumn, the investigation reached beyond Virginia's borders. Coded correspondence led to arrests in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Poorhouse records revealed irregular adoptions approved without oversight. A network of intermediaries, some motivated by greed, others by desperation, had supplied the Sullivans and others like them for decades. Among the recovered letters was a list of initials and numbers believed to represent buyers. One set matched entries in the Sullivan ledger. Next to several names appeared the mark HB. Every lead pointed south, to Charleston, and to the man whose name Constance had spoken only once, Henry Blackwood. The trail was clear now, but it was also dangerous. Wealth and influence shielded men like Blackwood. To challenge them would mean confronting not only individual guilt, but an entire social structure built on silence. Crawford understood that. Still, he prepared his final report to the governor with characteristic simplicity. "If we turn away from this, we will have learned nothing. The darkness will only change its shape." The next phase of the investigation would leave the hills of Virginia behind, following the trail into the heart of the southern plantations where privilege and cruelty often walked hand in hand. What began as the sin of one farmhouse was about to expose something far greater, a system that thrived in the blind spots of conscience. By the winter of 1835, the Sullivan investigation had outgrown the boundaries of Virginia. What began as a single farmhouse raid was now a case file several inches thick on the desk of the United States Marshal Service. Letters, receipts, coded correspondence, all pointing toward one name that kept recurring in different handwriting and under different aliases: Henry Blackwood. Blackwood was no shadowy drifter. He was one of Charleston's most prominent landowners, a man whose wealth came from shipping and cotton, whose family attended the best church pews, whose donations lined the walls of hospitals and schools. In polite society, he was known for his charm and his quiet generosity. In the coded ledgers from Milbrook, however, his initials appeared beside payments and quantities listed with a chilling regularity. The paper trail Deputy Marshal Jonathan Price and Sheriff Crawford worked through the winter to build a paper case strong enough to withstand the political resistance they knew would come. They mapped the correspondence, tracing shipments of domestics and apprentices that matched records of missing children in multiple states. Each route followed the same pattern: Philadelphia to Baltimore, Baltimore to Richmond, Richmond to Charleston, like a dark artery running down the eastern seaboard. To protect witnesses, the government created a temporary safe house in Richmond for the rescued Milbrook children who could speak. Out of the 47, only 12 were strong enough to testify in any form. Their statements were taken gently with a physician present, their words transcribed exactly as spoken. They remembered carriages arriving at night, whispered instructions, new faces that appeared and disappeared. One older girl recalled hearing the name Mr. Blackwood from Constance herself. "He pays promptly," she had said. Those 3 words, "he pays promptly," became the foundation of the federal case. The Charleston connection. When federal officers reached Charleston in March 1835, they encountered walls higher than any courthouse could build. Blackwood's reputation shielded him. Local officials were polite but evasive. Records disappeared. Clerks suddenly forgot details. It was an investigator from Philadelphia, a man named Samuel Pierce, and who finally broke through. Pierce had once worked as an overseer on one of Blackwood's smaller properties. Guilt and illness had driven him north years earlier. Now, hearing rumors of the Sullivan inquiry, he came forward voluntarily. His testimony was careful and exact. He confirmed that Blackwood had dealings with a woman in Virginia who supplied young laborers. He described deliveries that arrived under tarpaulins. The children kept apart from enslaved field workers, assigned to domestic quarters where few outsiders ever went. What Pierce provided more than anything was proof of organization, a chain of transactions, names, and dates that matched the coded ledgers from Milbrook. Price summarized the evidence in a report to Washington. This is no solitary wickedness. It is a trade conducted under the appearance of charity and managed with the discipline of business. National reverberations. The revelation struck the country like a thunderclap. Newspapers that had once whispered about the Virginia scandal now printed columns demanding federal oversight. Editorialists called it a traffic in innocence. Church leaders denounced it from pulpits. Reformers used it as a rallying cry for child protection laws. For the first time, ordinary citizens saw the fragility of children born outside family privilege, yet not everyone welcomed exposure. Some Southern papers dismissed the story as abolitionist propaganda. Others accused Northern journalists of inventing horrors to embarrass the region. The political divide of the 1830s between reform and tradition, between industrial cities and agricultural estates, now had a moral dimension that could not easily be ignored. Back in Virginia, Crawford felt the strain of the attention. His mail doubled, filled with letters of outrage and gratitude in equal measure. He answered few. Instead, he focused on preparing the final indictment. When asked later how he endured the constant pressure, he said only, "Every page I sign is a grave marker for a child who cannot speak." The federal inquiry, in July 1835, a federal grand jury convened in Richmond. For nearly a month, investigators presented evidence: the Sullivan ledgers, the decoded letters, Pierce's sworn statement, and a collection of signatures linking payments from Charleston, Savannah, and even New Orleans. The picture that emerged was vast and methodical, an informal network of brokers, transporters, and buyers operating beneath the loose laws of the early republic. The inquiry's proceedings were sober, rather than sensational. Judges and clerks avoided speculation, recording only what could be proved. But those present in the courtroom later said the atmosphere carried an almost spiritual weight, as though the nation itself were being asked to account for something it had refused to see. When the indictments were finally read, the list of defendants filled 3 pages. At the top, Henry Blackwood of Charleston and Ezra Sullivan of Henrico County, Virginia. Constance Sullivan was charged separately, accused of orchestrating the transport and concealment of minors across state lines, language that would later form the template for the first federal trafficking statute. Repercussions in Milbrook. Back home, Milbrook struggled to reconcile its guilt with its daily life. The field still needed tending, the church still rang its bell, yet nothing felt the same. Farmers avoided the road past the Sullivan ruins. Henderson's store ledger remained open to the pages that bore Constance's careful handwriting, as if the town required a visible reminder of its blindness. The rescued children were placed with foster families screened by the church. Some began to recover. A few even smiled when they played outside again. Dr. Whitfield dedicated his remaining years to their care, opening a small clinic that treated orphans free of charge. "I cannot undo what I ignored," he wrote, "but I can listen now when a child is silent." The trial of 1836. The formal trial opened in Richmond the following spring. Crowds lined the courthouse steps. Pamphlets were printed by the hundreds. The prosecution presented a simple narrative built on documents and testimony, not emotion. Constance refused to testify, maintaining a calm, detached silence that unnerved even her own counsel. Ezra spoke briefly, admitting that he had obeyed his wife's instructions, but claiming ignorance of her larger dealings. Few believed him. After weeks of testimony, the verdicts came swiftly. Ezra Sullivan was found guilty of kidnapping and unlawful confinement and sentenced to death by hanging. Constance Sullivan received life imprisonment. The courtroom silence when the sentence was read was total. Even the reporters laid down their pens. Blackwood's fall in Charleston. Henry Blackwood's wealth could delay justice, but not erase it. Under mounting public outrage, federal marshals seized his correspondence and financial ledgers. The evidence was overwhelming. Payments matching the Milbrook records, shipments described in euphemisms identical to Constance's code. Facing certain conviction, Blackwood fled to his coastal estate where he was arrested without resistance. He would die in prison 5 years later, awaiting appeal. The broader reckoning. The exposure of the network forced the young republic to confront questions it had never formally considered. Who protects those who cannot speak for themselves? What is the government's duty when cruelty hides behind private property and reputation? In response, Congress passed limited but precedent-setting legislation, empowering federal marshals to investigate crimes that crossed state borders, particularly those involving the sale or transport of minors. The law was narrow, imperfect, and rarely enforced, but it existed. For the first time, there was language for what had been unspeakable. Crawford retired soon after. He kept a single notebook from the investigation, bound in cracked leather. Inside, beneath lists of dates and signatures, he had written a single line: "Silence is the first accomplice of every crime." Epilogue to a network. By 1840, the Sullivan farmhouse had been torn down. The ground was leveled, the cellar filled, the site marked only by a modest wooden cross placed by townspeople who needed a symbol more than an answer. A decade later, a small stone replaced the wood, engraved simply "To the Lost and the Found, 1834. Historians would later argue about the true scope of the network. How many children vanished? How many perpetrators escaped justice? But one fact remained clear. The Sullivan case had forced a transformation. It taught lawmakers, doctors, and ordinary citizens that good intentions and polite appearances could not replace vigilance. In the decades that followed, new orphan asylums were built under public supervision, medical schools adopted ethical standards, and local sheriffs were instructed to investigate even the most implausible rumor of abuse. Each small reform traced its lineage back to that cold April morning, when two lawmen pried open a locked cellar door in the hills of Virginia. Crawford lived long enough to see those changes take root. In his final letter to a friend, he wrote, "We cannot cleanse what happened, but we can guard against its echo. Evil is patient, so must goodness be." The trials were over, but the questions they raised would linger for generations. In the spring of 1837, the courthouse in Richmond stood quieter than it had in months. The press had moved on to other scandals, the crowds had thinned, and yet the echo of the Sullivan affair remained in every legal discussion, every sermon, every whispered conversation about the responsibilities of ordinary people. For the survivors, life became a long road of recovery rather than closure. The 47 children who had been found beneath the Sullivan farmhouse were placed in care through a mixture of church charity and private sponsorship. Some were eventually adopted. Others remained under the watch of reformers who believed they should never again be separated from one another. Physicians described slow progress, fewer nightmares, stronger appetites, hesitant laughter returning after years of silence. The youngest had little memory of the basement. The oldest remembered too much. When asked years later how they survived, one former child answered simply, "We waited for the light to come through the cracks." That sentence, recorded in a physician's journal, became a symbol of endurance for a country beginning to define compassion as more than sentiment. The birth of reform, the public reaction to the case did not fade as quickly as most scandals of the era. The shock of seeing ordinary respectability used as a mask for organized cruelty provoked a slow but decisive shift in American law. Between 1837 and 1840, 3 states passed legislation requiring formal registration of orphanages and charitable homes. Virginia's statute, drafted by a committee that included Dr. Marcus Whitfield, established the first system of government inspection for child welfare institutions in the United States. Whitfield had become an unlikely reformer. The same man who once handed Constance Sullivan medicines without question now traveled from county to county, urging physicians to examine the conditions in which children were kept. His 1841 pamphlet, On the Moral Duties of the Medical Profession, argued that doctors bore a social responsibility beyond the treatment of illness. They must, he wrote, guard the defenseless from harm concealed behind the language of care. It was distributed in medical schools across the country and cited for decades as an early statement of professional ethics. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, the man who first stepped into the Sullivan cellar, received a promotion to federal marshal. He declined it twice before accepting, saying only that he wished to finish what was begun. Over the next decade, he quietly assisted in investigations of similar cases in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Each time he insisted on thorough documentation, careful handling of witnesses, and respect for the living rather than fascination with the dead. His reports would later influence the investigative manuals of the newly established Justice Department. The town that remembered Milbrook never fully recovered from the shame of its complicity. The farm was gone, the land sown with wild grass, but the memory remained. The church bell tolled each April 8th, the date of the discovery, without announcement or sermon. It became known locally as the Day of the Unheard. Children born long after the events learned to bow their heads in silence when the bell rang. Though many no longer knew exactly why, Mrs. Henderson, who had once sold flour and medicine to Constance, kept the old store ledger on a shelf behind the counter for the rest of her life. When asked why, she would say, "To remind me that kindness without curiosity can be a terrible thing." Visitors who came through Milbrook in later years described a community cautious but not bitter. Its people learned to ask questions gently but firmly, to check on neighbors not out of suspicion but out of care. In that way, the tragedy left behind a legacy of vigilance rather than vengeance. As a nation confronts its conscience, the Sullivan affair resonated far beyond Virginia. In northern cities, reformers used the story to advocate for the creation of public orphan asylums. In the South, where plantation wealth often insulated cruelty from scrutiny, it became a whispered warning. Even those with power could not be certain that secrecy would last forever. Religious organizations founded new societies for the protection of children. The Methodist Church established the Home for the Friendless in Baltimore, citing the late revelations in Virginia as their moral impetus. Newspapers published serialized editorials under titles like The Price of Silence and Mother Sullivan's Orphans. Some of these accounts exaggerated the details, but even the most fictionalized versions carried the essential truth that neglect, disguised as charity, could fester into atrocity if left unexamined. In Washington, a small group of legislators pushed for broader oversight of interstate transport. They framed their proposals carefully, avoiding words that would inflame the already volatile politics of the 1830s. Yet their intent was unmistakable. The first federal statute to prohibit the unlawful removal or sale of minors across state boundaries passed quietly in 1838. Though limited in scope, it set a legal precedent that later generations would expand. The survivors' stories of the original 47 children, the historical record preserves only fragments of their later lives. Some names were changed by adoption. Others disappeared into the anonymity of the growing nation. But one survivor, known in the records as Rebecca, became a quiet emblem of endurance. She was 14 when rescued, articulate and strong enough to testify during the inquiry. Afterward, she was taken in by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, who valued silence and compassion over spectacle. She grew into adulthood surrounded by gentleness, married, and raised children of her own. When she died in 1893 at the age of 73, her grandchildren found among her papers a single page written in a careful hand. "I once lived where the sun did not reach. Now it rises every day, and I never take it for granted." Her descendants donated that note to a local historical society, where it remains preserved as a testament not to horror, but to the capacity for healing. The legacy of the case in the decades that followed. The phrase "another Sullivan case" entered legal vocabulary as shorthand for institutional failure. The tragedy that arises when good people trust too easily and systems ask too few questions. Lawyers invoked it when arguing for greater oversight. Journalists used it when exposing abuse in orphanages and factories. It became a warning, a lesson, a moral boundary line. By the late 19th century, as industrialization spread and child labor became a national concern, reformers traced the roots of their movement back to Milbrook. They saw in the Sullivan story the first public acknowledgement that society owed its children. More than sympathy, it owed them protection. Historians now regard the case as a turning point between an era of informal charity and the beginnings of organized child welfare. It showed that good intentions were not enough, that empathy required structure, law, and constant attention. It revealed, too, that evil often thrives not in chaos but in order, when rules serve reputation instead of justice. A final reflection. In his final years, Sheriff Crawford lived quietly near the edge of the same hills where the story had begun. Visitors recalled him as courteous but distant, a man who carried invisible weight with dignity. Shortly before his death, he wrote one last letter to Dr. Whitfield, who by then had become a respected advocate for medical ethics. The letter, preserved in the Library of Virginia, reads, "We thought the horror was the cellar itself, but the true horror was the ease with which we explained it away. Let every man of conscience keep his ear tuned to the small unlikely sounds that others call imagination. That is where the truth begins." After his passing, the citizens of Milbrook erected a modest stone at the site of the old Sullivan farm. No grand monument, no names, only an inscription chosen by the surviving children now grown, for the lost voices, found at last. Each year, when spring rain softens the ground and the air carries the scent of wild mint from the hills, visitors still come to that quiet spot. They bring no flowers, only silence. The breeze stirs through the grass and the sound is gentle, almost like breathing. If one listens long enough, it is easy to imagine the faint rhythm of hope beneath the earth, an echo of those who endured, and a reminder that vigilance, compassion, and courage are the only lasting memorials to the innocent. Epilogue. The Sullivan case faded from headlines but not from history. It remains a reference point in legal studies, ethics lectures, and social work classrooms. Scholars debate its details. Storytellers revisit its lessons. Each generation finds something new in it. Some see a warning, others a call to action. But the essence endures. Evil rarely announces itself with thunder. More often it comes quietly, in the shape of trust wearing the face of kindness. And sometimes it takes only one person who refuses to look away to bring the truth into light. That, more than anything else, is the legacy of Milbrook. The whisper that became a reckoning, the darkness that taught a nation how to see.